They laughed when an obese widow paid $1 for a mountain man with a sack on his head. To them, it was just another cruel joke. A foolish woman, a broken man, and a dollar no one cared about. But when that sack came off and the dust settled, the town realized this wasn't a joke at all. Something was hidden beneath that burlap, and it wasn't just his face. Before the sun sets, this quiet widow and her dollar man will force a town to reckon with promises long buried. The real question is, when the crowd stops laughing, who'll dare stand with her? Before we dive into today's story, I'd love to know where you are watching from. Seeing your comments really reminds me why I do this every day. The early morning mist clung to the muddy streets of Grafton Junction as Abigail May Dorsey guided her old mule cart through the awakening town. The wooden wheels creaked and splashed through puddles left by yesterday's rain, while her trusted mule, Benjamin, picked his way carefully around the deeper ruts. The railroad town was already stirring, though the sun had barely lifted above the eastern hills. Abigail's weathered hands gripped the reins tighter as she passed the general store, where small clusters of townsfolk huddled together, their whispers carrying on the damp morning air. "Sheriff's auction?" she heard one woman mutter. "Another debtor to shame," came the reply. The familiar scent of fresh-baked bread from her own shop drifted behind her, but today Abigail had more pressing matters than her morning deliveries. In her apron pocket, a single silver dollar weighed heavy, not with its worth but with purpose. She'd polished it carefully the night before, until it gleamed like a star in her palm. As her cart approached the town square, more people gathered, mostly railroad men in their dark coats and bowler hats. They stood in loose circles, passing whiskey flasks and making sport of the morning's entertainment. The sheriff's debtor auctions had become a cruel tradition in Grafton Junction, a way for the railroad to humiliate those who couldn't pay their fines. Abigail pulled Benjamin to a halt near the wooden platform that served as the auction block. Her heart thumped against her ribs, but she kept her chin high as she climbed down from the cart. Several men cast sideways glances her way. The widow baker had never attended one of these spectacles before. The crowd's murmuring grew louder as Sheriff Amos Bragg emerged from the jailhouse. He was leading a prisoner whose massive frame made even the sheriff look small. The man's hands were bound in iron shackles, and a crude burlap sack covered his head. His shirt was torn and stained, but his back was straight despite the obvious weight of the chains. "Good morning, good citizens of Grafton Junction!" Sheriff Bragg's voice boomed across the square. He tugged the prisoner forward roughly, causing him to stumble on the platform steps. "Today we have a special lot for auction. This here's a drifter caught trespassing on railroad property. His fine stands at $1, but his labor might be worth something to the right buyer." Laughter rippled through the crowd. $1 was an insult. Everyone knew these auctions were meant to mock, not to trade fairly. The railroad men usually bid pennies for the entertainment of it all. The sheriff waited, his thumbs hooked in his gun belt. "Do I hear any bids?" Silence fell over the square. Even the mockers seemed hesitant before this giant of a man. Abigail's fingers closed around the silver dollar in her pocket. Her voice came out clear and steady, though her knees trembled beneath her skirts. $1. The crowd erupted in laughter. Men elbowed each other, pointing at the widow baker with her gray-streaked hair and flour-dusted apron. Sheriff Bragg's face twisted in a mixture of amusement and annoyance. "Now, Mrs. Dorsey," he drawled, "surely you don't mean to—" "I have $1, Abigail interrupted, already walking toward the platform. Her boots made hollow sounds on the wooden steps as she climbed up. She held out the polished coin, letting it catch the morning light. "That's the price you named, Sheriff Bragg? Will you honor it?" The sheriff's jaw worked back and forth as he looked from Abigail to the railroad men in the crowd. But there was nothing to be done. He'd named the price himself, and she'd met it fair and square. "It's your funeral," he muttered, snatching the dollar from her hand. He shoved the prisoner's chain toward her and stomped off the platform. Abigail stood before the bound man, aware of every eye in the square fixed upon them. With gentle hands, she reached for the burlap sack. The rough fabric scratched against her palms as she lifted it away. The face revealed was weathered and scarred, with deep lines etched around eyes that had seen too much hardship. A jagged mark ran from his left temple to his jaw, and his dark hair was streaked with gray at the temples. Those eyes met hers, sharp, intelligent, and completely unreadable. This was Caleb Thorne, though she didn't know his name yet. In that moment, as the morning sun broke fully over Grafton Junction, widow and prisoner stood facing each other on the auction block, their shadows stretching long across the muddy square. Abigail gently took hold of the iron chains binding Caleb's wrists, careful not to pull too hard. "This way," she said softly, leading him down the wooden steps of the auction platform. The crowd parted before them, their earlier mockery fading into uncertain whispers. The morning sun cast long shadows as they made their way down Grafton Junction's main street. Caleb's boots scraped against the muddy ground, his steps stiff and measured. He towered over Abigail's slight frame, but followed her lead without resistance, though wariness radiated from his tense shoulders. As they passed the Silver Spur Saloon, several railroad men lounged on the porch, passing a bottle between them. One opened his mouth for what promised to be a crude comment, but something in Abigail's steady gaze made him think better of it. The morning bustle of the street fell into uneasy silence as townsfolk stopped to stare at the odd pair. Abigail's bakery stood at the quieter end of the street, its weathered, clapboard exterior showing signs of wear. A few window panes bore spiderweb cracks, and the green paint had faded to a pale sage. But warm lamplight glowed through the windows, and the rich scent of fresh-baked bread wafted from within. She guided Caleb up the creaking steps and through the front door. The shop's interior was modest but clean, with a worn counter displaying half a dozen loaves and a basket of yesterday's rolls. A pot-bellied stove squatted in the corner, radiating welcome heat. "Please sit there," Abigail gestured to a sturdy chair near the stove. "Let me fetch you some water first." Caleb remained standing, his eyes taking in every detail of the room, marking the exits, studying the shadows. His silence felt heavy, like a wall built of years of distrust. Abigail returned with a tin cup of fresh well water. "Here," she offered it carefully, mindful of his shackled hands. "I've got some stew warming too, if you're hungry." He accepted the water with the barest nod, drinking deeply. When he finished, he sat in the offered chair, though his posture remained alert, ready to spring up at any moment. The chains clinked softly as he settled. Abigail busied herself at the stove, ladling thick stew into a bowl. The rich aroma of beef and vegetables filled the small space. She placed the bowl on a small table beside him, along with a chunk of fresh bread. "Eat," she encouraged. "You look like you haven't had a proper meal in quite some time." Caleb studied her face, as if searching for some hidden motive behind the kindness. Finding none, he began to eat, slowly at first, then with increasing hunger. Abigail sat at her work table nearby, giving him space while she tallied the day's accounts in her ledger. When the bowl was empty and the bread gone, Abigail cleared her throat softly. "I expect you're wondering why I bought your contract," she began. "The truth is, I need help. The roof leaks something terrible when it rains, and I'm not strong enough to haul the supplies up there myself." She folded her hands in her lap. "I don't expect anything beyond honest work from you. Once the roof is fixed, you'll be free to go your way." Caleb's scarred face remained impassive, but something shifted in his eyes. Surprise, perhaps, or the first crack in his armor of suspicion. When he spoke, his voice was rough from disuse. "Much obliged for the meal, ma'am." Those 4 words seemed to cost him great effort, but they were offered sincerely. Abigail smiled gently and began clearing away the dishes. As evening settled over Grafton Junction, Abigail showed Caleb to a small room off the kitchen, where she'd laid out a clean blanket and pillow. Then she retired to her own quarters upstairs, leaving him to his privacy. In her bedroom, Abigail knelt beside her narrow bed, clasping her hands in prayer. "Lord, guide my path," she whispered. "Help me honor Thomas's promise." She reached for an old, folded map on her bedside table, running her fingers over its worn creases before tucking it away again. Downstairs, Caleb sat motionless in the darkness, listening to the quiet sounds of the settling house. His keen eyes caught sight of the map's corner, protruding from beneath some papers on Abigail's work table. Even in the dim light, he could make out a strange symbol marked in faded ink, one he'd never seen before, yet somehow stirred a distant memory. The chains on his wrists felt lighter somehow, though they were just as heavy as before. For the first time in years, someone had looked at him and seen a man, not a beast to be caged. He closed his eyes, letting the lingering warmth from the stove seep into his bones, while questions about the mysterious map and this unexpected kindness circled in his mind. Dawn painted the sky in soft pinks and golds as Caleb climbed the rickety ladder to Abigail's roof. His chains had been removed that morning, though the marks on his wrists remained tender. The wooden shingles creaked under his weight as he carefully tested each step. From his perch, he could see most of Grafton Junction spreading out below: the general store, the telegraph office, and the ever-present railroad tracks cutting through town like an iron snake. Townsfolk passing by cast suspicious glances upward, some stopping to whisper behind raised hands. "Ain't right, her keeping that wild one up there," a woman in a blue bonnet muttered to her companion. "Mark my words, no good'll come of it." Caleb ignored them, focusing instead on prying up the rotted shingles. His large hands, rough from years of labor, worked with surprising gentleness to avoid causing more damage. The morning sun beat down on his back as he methodically cleared away the damaged sections. The creak of wagon wheels drew his attention to the street below. Abigail was returning from the mercantile, her cart loaded with sacks of fresh flour. Before she could reach the bakery's door, a well-dressed man stepped into her path. "Mrs. Dorsey," the man called out, removing his black bowler hat. "Might I have a word?" Caleb watched as Abigail's shoulders stiffened slightly, though her voice remained pleasant. "Good morning, Mr. Castor. I'm afraid I'm quite busy with deliveries this morning." Castor moved closer, his polished boots somehow avoiding the street's mud. "This won't take but a moment of your time." He gestured toward the bakery. "I understand your property sits atop a rather valuable spring." "My well provides all I need for the bakery," Abigail replied, her hands tightening on the wagon's handles. "Come now, Mrs. Dorsey." Castor's smile didn't reach his eyes. "We both know there's more to it than that. The railroad could make you a generous offer. Better to sell now than wait until progress forces your hand." Abigail drew herself up straight, though she barely reached Castor's shoulder. "Thank you for your concern, Mr. Castor, but this land is not for sale. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have bread to bake." She stepped around him with quiet dignity, leading her cart toward the bakery. Castor watched her go, his friendly mask slipping for just a moment to reveal something harder underneath. As the morning wore on, more townspeople gathered below, drawn by both curiosity about Caleb and the fresh bread scents wafting from Abigail's ovens. Their gossip drifted up to where he worked. "Heard tell her husband died in some mess over property lines," an old man said, leaning on his cane. "Thomas Dorsey was a fool," another replied. "Standing up to the wrong folks he was. Left her all alone with that cursed land." Caleb's hands stilled on the roof. He glanced down through a gap in the shingles, catching glimpses of Abigail moving about her kitchen below. Her movements were sure and steady, but he noticed how her shoulders carried an invisible weight. When the sun reached its peak, Abigail called him down for dinner. She'd set out cold meat, cheese, and fresh bread on her small work table. Caleb cleaned his hands thoroughly before sitting, conscious of the sawdust and dirt covering his clothes. "Ma'am," he said quietly, breaking the comfortable silence, "are you in real trouble here?" Abigail's hands stilled on her bread knife. She seemed to wrestle with herself before meeting his eyes. "There's a spring beneath this land," she admitted softly. The Apache people call it sacred. Say it holds healing powers. She twisted her worn wedding ring. My Thomas, he made a promise to their elders that we'd protect it, keep it from being spoiled by greed. She looked down at her hands. He died keeping that promise. Sometimes I wonder if I'm strong enough to do the same. Caleb absorbed this in silence, thinking of the railroad agent's veiled threats, the townsfolk's whispers, and this quiet woman's determined dignity. Finally, he pushed back from the table. "Let me fetch water from the well," he said, reaching for the bucket. "No sense in you struggling with it while I'm here." It was a simple offer, but they both understood it meant more. Abigail's eyes brightened with unshed tears as she nodded her thanks. Caleb stepped out into the noon sun, bucket in hand, his shadow falling protective and tall across the bakery's threshold. Behind him, Abigail returned to her work, her steps lighter, knowing she no longer stood alone. The late morning sun beat down as Caleb followed the worn path behind Abigail's bakery. Thorny mesquite branches caught at his sleeves while dry grass crunched beneath his boots. The wooden bucket swung heavy in his grip as he pushed through the scratching underbrush. After 10 minutes of walking, the vegetation opened into a small clearing. There, nestled between weather-worn rocks, the spring bubbled up from the earth. The water ran crystal clear over smooth stones, catching sunlight like scattered diamonds. A few desert flowers, their purple petals bright against the dusty ground, grew along its edges. Caleb knelt beside the spring, setting down his bucket. His reflection wavered in the pure water. A face lined with years of hard living stared back at him. Memory washed over him like a cold wave. He'd been here before, years ago. Back then, he'd worn a scout's badge, mapping water sources for the Army's new outposts. His pencil had marked this spring on crisp paper, never thinking about what that mark would mean, never considering the lives it would change. The bucket dipped into the spring with a gentle splash. As water filled it, Caleb's weathered hands trembled slightly. He'd helped the Army claim so many places like this, believing he was bringing progress to wild lands. Now the weight of those choices sat heavy in his chest. "The water remembers you, Scout Thorne." The quiet voice made Caleb's spine stiffen. He turned slowly, water dripping from the bucket's rim. Henry Nez stood at the clearing's edge, his lined face impassive beneath gray hair. The elderly Apache's eyes were sharp as obsidian, fixed on Caleb with the weight of shared history. "Henry?" Caleb acknowledged, his voice rough. "Been a long time." "Not long enough for some?" Henry's words carried the chill of old betrayal. "I remember when you first found this place. Your maps helped them build forts on our hunting grounds." Shame burned in Caleb's throat. He set down the bucket, facing the older man squarely. "I was wrong," he said simply. "Thought I was bringing civilization. Instead, I brought greed wearing a uniform." Henry studied him for a long moment. The only sound was the spring's gentle burbling and a distant hawk's cry. Finally, the Apache elder moved closer, his moccasins silent on the rocky ground. "The widow woman who bought you, she is different from the others," Henry said. "She and her husband understood the spring's sacred nature. They kept their word when others broke theirs." "She seems a decent sort," Caleb agreed carefully. "Decent won't be enough." Henry's face grew grave. "The railroad men are like coyotes. They circle, waiting for weakness. Their greed is a sickness that spreads like poison in the water." Caleb nodded, thinking of Castor's sleek manner and hidden threats. "What can be done?" "Perhaps nothing." Henry gazed at the spring. "Or perhaps everything. The widow's kindness touches hearts others cannot reach. Even old scouts can find new paths, eh?" A ghost of a smile touched the elder's weathered face. He reached down, scooping a handful of the clear water. It ran through his fingers as he spoke softly in Apache, a blessing or a prayer. When Caleb returned to town, the bucket was heavy with spring water. His arms ached from carrying it, and blisters had formed on his palms where the handle had rubbed. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across Grafton Junction's muddy streets. Inside the bakery, the air was warm and sweet with fresh baked bread. Abigail looked up from her work table, flour dusting her arms. Her eyes widened at his raw hands. "Land's sakes, you should have said something about those blisters forming," she chided gently. "Sit down here and let me tend to them." Before Caleb could protest, she was gathering supplies: clean cloth, a jar of honey, and cool water. Her touch was gentle as she cleaned his palms. "Honey helps prevent festering," she explained, spreading the golden liquid carefully. "My Thomas taught me that, back when he'd come home with work-worn hands." Across town in the telegraph office, a different scene was unfolding. The operator's fingers flew across his key, transcribing an incoming message. The paper he handed to Mr. Castor was brief but clear. "Expedite acquisition by any means necessary. Stop. Board expects results within month. Stop. No excuses accepted. Stop." Castor folded the telegram precisely, tucking it into his vest pocket. His pleasant expression never wavered as he stepped out onto the boardwalk, but his eyes were cold as he gazed toward Abigail's bakery. Inside, unaware of the gathering storm, Abigail finished wrapping Caleb's hands in clean strips of cloth. The afternoon light streamed golden through her windows, catching the flower motes dancing in the air like dust in a dream. The next morning dawned clear and cool. Caleb stood in the bakery's yard, surveying the worn shutters hanging askew from weather-beaten windows. Beside him, Abigail held a bucket of nails and a hammer, her sleeves rolled up for work. "These two need replacing entirely," Caleb said, running his bandaged hand along splintered wood. "The others might hold if we reinforce them." Abigail nodded, handing him the tools. "Whatever you think best. I trust your judgment." Those simple words settled strange in Caleb's chest. Trust wasn't something he'd known in recent years. Yet here was this widow, treating him like a man worthy of respect. They worked through the morning hours, the steady rhythm of hammering punctuated by comfortable silence. Abigail steadied the shutters while Caleb drove in nails, their movements falling into an easy partnership. By midday, they'd moved to clearing the storage shed. Years of collected debris filled its dark corners: broken crates, rusty tools, and dirt-crusted jars. Caleb hauled the heavier items, while Abigail sorted through smaller ones, saving what could be salvaged. The bell above the bakery door chimed occasionally as townspeople came for Abigail's famous honey rolls. Each visitor's eyes would drift to Caleb, their expressions shifting from wariness to thoughtful consideration. Here was the man they'd seen in chains, now working steadily beside their respected widow, his actions speaking louder than words. Sarah Miller, the school teacher, paused longer than most. "Those shutters look right proper now," she commented, clutching her paper-wrapped rolls. "Makes the whole street look better." More folks came as the afternoon wore on. Some nodded to Caleb. Others offered brief words about the improvements. Each interaction carried the weight of judgment, slowly giving way to acceptance. As evening approached, Abigail and Caleb sat at her small kitchen table, sharing a simple supper of bread and stew. The lamp's warm glow softened the shadows in her tired face. "Thomas had such dreams for this place," Abigail said softly, breaking the comfortable silence. "He wanted the bakery to be more than just a shop. He saw it becoming a gathering place where everyone, settler and native alike, could break bread together." She traced the worn grain of the wooden table. "He learned so much from the Apache people about local grains, about living in harmony with the land. Said their wisdom deserved respect, not destruction." Caleb set down his spoon, shame burning in his throat. "I was part of that destruction once," he admitted roughly. "As a scout, I helped the army map their sacred places, their water sources. Told myself I was bringing progress. Instead, I brought betrayal." Abigail's eyes held no judgment as she reached across the table, her hand resting lightly on his arm. "The past is written in stone, but the future is shaped by the choices we make now. You're choosing differently today. That's what matters." The quiet strength in her voice eased something tight in Caleb's chest. Outside, crickets chirped their evening song as darkness settled over Grafton Junction. Later that night, after the lamps were dimmed, a soft tapping came at the bakery's back door. Abigail opened it to find Henry Nez standing in the shadows, his expression grave. "May I enter, Mrs. Dorsey?" he asked formally. "Of course, Henry. Please come in." Abigail stepped aside as the Apache elder slipped inside, followed by Caleb from where he'd been sleeping in the storage room. Henry pulled a folded document from his leather vest. "This is a copy of the original treaty," he said, spreading the yellowed paper on the table. "It clearly shows the spring lands were protected, meant to remain undisturbed." His weathered finger traced the careful signatures. "But the railroad men, they are preparing false papers. My grandson works in their offices as a cleaner. He has seen them practicing signatures, creating documents with different dates." Abigail's face paled in the lamplight. "They mean to forge proof that they own the land?" Henry nodded solemnly. "They will claim the treaty was never properly filed, that later sales supersede it. Unless we can prove otherwise, their corrupt judges will believe their corrupt papers." Caleb studied the treaty, his jaw tight. Here was another example of the betrayals he'd once been part of. But now he stood on the other side, with people fighting to preserve something sacred. "We'll need help," he said quietly. "People in town who'll stand with us when the railroad makes its move." "Yes," Henry agreed. "And we must move carefully. The railroad men have many eyes, many ears. They will not give up such valuable land without a fight." Abigail gathered the treaty with trembling hands, but her voice was steady. "Then we'll be ready to fight, not with guns or fists, but with truth and community. It's what Thomas would have done." Morning sunlight filtered through the church's dusty windows as Abigail and Caleb approached Pastor Ellis. The old preacher stood near his pulpit, nervously adjusting his collar at their arrival. The treaty papers rustled in Abigail's hands as she carefully unfolded them. "Pastor Ellis, we need your help," Abigail said softly. "Henry Nez brought us this treaty copy, but we need more proof to protect the spring." The pastor's thin frame seemed to shrink further as he glanced at the documents. "Mrs. Dorsey, these are troubled times. The railroad men, they have ways of making life difficult for those who oppose them." Caleb stepped forward, his voice low but firm. "Sir, we believe the church ledger contains the original land survey, the one that shows the spring's true boundaries." Pastor Ellis wrung his hands, pacing between the wooden pews. Yes, it does. But Mr. Castor has made it clear that church donations might dry up if certain documents come to light." "Pastor," Abigail's gentle tone carried steel beneath it, "my Thomas always said doing right ain't about counting the cost. It's about standing firm when others won't." The preacher's shoulders slumped as he moved to a worn cabinet behind the pulpit. His trembling fingers retrieved a leather-bound ledger, its pages yellow with age. "The survey is here, but I cannot openly support you. The risk, ... "We understand," Abigail assured him, carefully copying the survey details onto a separate sheet. "Your silence is protection enough." As they left the church, Caleb noticed dark clouds gathering on the horizon. "Storm's coming," he muttered, but his words carried more meaning than just weather. That afternoon, while Abigail kneaded dough for tomorrow's bread, loud voices carried from the street. Mr. Castor stood with 3 rough-looking men blocking the weekly wood delivery wagon. "Sorry, Mrs. Dorsey," the driver called out, genuine regret in his voice. "Been told the road's closed for railway business. Can't make deliveries down this way no more." Abigail's face paled. Without wood, she couldn't fire her ovens. Without her ovens, the bakery would close within days. Castor tipped his hat with mock politeness. "Just following company regulations, ma'am. Nothing personal, you understand." That evening, Caleb stacked what little wood remained beside the bakery's back door. The pile would last 3 days at most. Abigail worked silently nearby, her hands steady despite the worry etched on her face. The moon rose full and bright as night settled over the town. Caleb sat in the shadows of the storage room, a carpenter's hammer gripped in his calloused hand. Hours ticked by, marked only by the soft clicking of Abigail's clock. Near midnight, the sound of boots scuffing dirt broke the silence. 3 figures crept toward the woodpile, carrying empty sacks. Castor's thugs, come to steal what little fuel remained. Caleb emerged from the shadows like a mountain lion, hammer raised. "Evening, boys," he growled, mighty late for a social call. The men froze, moonlight glinting off a concealed pistol, but Caleb stood his ground, his massive frame blocking their path to the wood. "Mr. Castor sent us to deliver a message," the tallest thug sneered, hand twitching toward his weapon. "Here's my message back," Caleb's voice rumbled like distant thunder. "Touch 1 stick of this lady's wood, and you'll need a doctor to remove this hammer from where I put it." The threat hung in the air like smoke. The men shifted uneasily, measuring Caleb's stance and the deadly, serious look in his eyes. Finally, the leader spat in the dirt. "Ain't worth the trouble," he muttered. "Let's go." They slunk away into the darkness, but the night's events spread through town like wildfire. By morning, everyone knew how Caleb Thorne had faced down 3 armed men with nothing but a hammer and raw courage. Later that night, Abigail found Caleb checking the woodpile one last time before retiring. "You didn't have to stand guard," she said softly. "They might have hurt you." Caleb turned, moonlight casting half his scarred face in shadow. "Yes, I did have to. Some things are worth protecting." Their eyes met in the silver light, and something unspoken passed between them. Abigail's hand reached out, touching his arm gently. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice carrying more than simple gratitude. Caleb's rough fingers covered hers for a brief moment. "Get some rest, Mrs. Dorsey. Tomorrow's another day of baking." As Abigail walked back inside, Caleb remained in the yard, his heart beating with unfamiliar warmth. The night air carried the scent of her fresh bread, of hope, and of something new taking root between them, fragile as a spring flower, but growing stronger with each passing day. Dawn painted the sky in shades of amber as Pastor Ellis hurried through Grafton Junction's empty streets. He clutched the church ledger close to his chest, its leather binding worn smooth by decades of faithful record-keeping. The morning air carried a bite of autumn chill, matching the nervous energy that surrounded the bakery. Inside, Abigail had already stoked the ovens, and the familiar scent of baking bread mingled with fresh coffee. Caleb sat at the worn kitchen table, his large frame making the wooden chair seem small. Henry Nez stood near the window, his weathered face thoughtful, as he watched the street for unwanted visitors. "I brought everything," Pastor Ellis whispered, though the bakery was empty of customers at this early hour. His hands trembled slightly as he laid the ledger on the table. Abigail cleared space among the flour-dusted surfaces, carefully spreading out Henry's treaty copy. Caleb unfolded the survey maps, their creased lines telling silent stories of boundaries and broken promises. "Here," Henry said, his finger tracing a line on the treaty. The spring boundaries were marked clear, following the old oak grove to Lightning Rock. His voice carried the weight of generations who had known these landmarks by heart. Pastor Ellis opened the church ledger, its pages crackling with age. "The original survey matches exactly," he said, pointing to the careful script. "See how the measurements align with the treaty markers?" Caleb leaned forward, his scarred face intent. "The railroad's new survey moved everything 50 yards west. That's how they're claiming rights to the spring." "My Thomas knew," Abigail said softly, touching the ledger's yellowed pages. "That's why he insisted on keeping our deed registered with both the town and the Apache Council?" Henry nodded gravely. Your husband honored his word, Mrs. Dorsey. Few men showed such respect for our agreements. The morning light grew stronger as they studied the documents, matching landmarks and measurements, building their case piece by piece. The evidence was clear. Abigail's deed was legally sound, protected by both territorial law and tribal treaty. The federal marshal makes his quarterly visit this Sunday, Pastor Ellis said, wringing his hands. If we present these documents then, with the whole town as witness, the railroad won't be able to hide their fraud, Caleb finished, his deep voice carrying conviction. Abigail's face showed concern. But standing against the railroad, it'll affect everyone. The station, the supply contracts, the mail service. The town must choose, Henry said, his words carrying quiet authority, between easy wealth built on lies or harder times walked in truth. Pastor Ellis straightened his thin shoulders. Sunday service brings everyone together. Even Mr. Castor attends for appearance's sake. With Marshal Davis present, they can't prevent the documents from being heard. They worked out the details as the morning advanced. Henry would bring tribal elders as witnesses. Pastor Ellis would present the church records during his sermon. Caleb would ensure no one disrupted the proceedings. It's a risk for all of you, Abigail said, looking at each face around her table. I can't ask. You didn't ask? Caleb interrupted gently. We chose? As the others prepared to leave, taking separate paths to avoid attention, Caleb stepped outside to the bakery's front. The old wooden sign hung crooked, its letters faded by sun and storm. He had been meaning to repair it for days. Abigail found him there later, carefully repainting the last letters. The fresh paint gleamed in the midday sun. Dorsey's bread and honor. Honor, Abigail read aloud, her voice catching slightly. Thomas would have liked that. Caleb climbed down from his ladder, studying his work. A bakery feeds more than bodies, Mrs. Dorsey. Your stand here, it's feeding something this town's been hungry for, something it forgot it needed. The sign swayed gently in the breeze, its new words a quiet declaration of principles worth defending. Below it, Abigail and Caleb stood together, watching the town go about its business, knowing that soon they would ask their neighbors to choose between comfortable silence and costly truth. Sunday morning dawned clear and crisp over Grafton Junction. The church bell's steady toll echoed through streets nearly empty, as most townsfolk had already gathered inside the whitewashed building. Abigail smoothed her best dress, a simple brown wool that had seen better days, and clutched the leather folder containing their precious documents. Caleb walked beside her, newly shaved and wearing a borrowed suit coat that strained across his broad shoulders. Henry Nez and 3 tribal elders followed, their dignified presence drawing curious stares from those still filing into the church. Inside, sunlight streamed through dusty windows, casting long shadows across worn wooden pews. Federal Marshal Davis sat in the front row, his badge catching the light. Railroad men clustered on one side, Mr. Castor among them in his fine Eastern suit, while townspeople filled the remaining seats. Pastor Ellis's hands trembled slightly as he opened the service, his voice growing stronger as he spoke of truth and justice. When the time came, he gestured for Abigail to step forward. She rose slowly, conscious of every creaking floorboard beneath her feet. The documents felt heavy in her hands as she turned to face her neighbors. Familiar faces looked back at her. Mrs. Peterson, who bought bread daily for her boarding house. Mr. Green, who'd helped Thomas repair the bakery roof years ago. Children she'd slipped extra cookies to when times were hard. My neighbors, Abigail began, her voice clear despite her racing heart, I stand before you with proof of a sacred trust. This land, and the spring that feeds it, was legally deeded to my late husband Thomas. She carefully laid out the original treaty and church ledger entries on a small table. Henry stepped forward, his presence commanding respect. The spring has been a meeting place of peace between our peoples for generations. Thomas Dorsey honored that tradition, and his widow continues his promise. Murmurs rippled through the congregation. Several older townsfolk nodded, remembering Thomas's fairness in dealing with both settlers and natives. Others recalled how the spring's pure water had sustained the town through drought years. Caleb moved to stand beside Abigail, his scarred face solemn. "Years ago, I helped map these territories for the army," he said, his deep voice carrying to the farthest pew. "I marked boundaries without thought for the promises being broken. That shame weighs heavy on my conscience." He paused, meeting Henry's steady gaze. "But today I stand to protect what's right. This land, this spring, they belong to Mrs. Dorsey by law and by sacred trust." The atmosphere in the church shifted perceptibly. Marshal Davis leaned forward, studying the documents with interest. Several railroad men shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Just then, Mr. Castor rose smoothly to his feet. "A touching tale," he said, his smile not reaching his eyes. "But perhaps the good people of Grafton Junction should see all the evidence." He withdrew a document from his coat pocket, the paper crisp and official-looking. "This deed, signed by Territorial Judge Matthews himself, clearly grants the railroad rights to all water sources within 50 yards of the proposed line." Fresh whispers erupted through the church. Judge Matthews was known for his powerful connections, and few dared challenge his authority. "That's a forgery," Henry said sharply, but Castor's smile only widened. "The judge's signature suggests otherwise," he replied smoothly, "though I'm sure the marshal will want to examine both claims carefully." Marshal Davis stood, his weathered face unreadable. "Indeed I will." He stepped forward, gathering both sets of documents. "These require careful review. I'll need time to verify signatures and compare surveys." Abigail felt her heart sink, but kept her spine straight. "How long, Marshal?" "A matter of weeks, perhaps months," he replied, carefully storing the papers in his satchel. "Until then, all parties should maintain their current positions. No new construction, no changes to existing agreements." Castor's smile faltered slightly at this restriction, but he bowed his head in apparent acceptance. The railroad men behind him looked less pleased. The congregation stirred restlessly as Pastor Ellis called for the closing hymn. As voices raised in song, Abigail noticed something different in the faces around her. Where there had been dismissal or indifference before, she now saw thoughtful consideration. Several townspeople met her eyes with encouraging nods. The marshal's postponement wasn't the victory they'd hoped for, but Abigail could feel the tide of public opinion shifting. She glanced at Caleb, finding strength in his steady presence beside her. Whatever came next, they would face it together. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across Grafton Junction's main street as Sheriff Bragg and two deputies marched toward Dorsey's bakery. Their boots kicked up dust, matching the grim determination on their faces. Inside, Abigail was kneading dough for the evening's honey rolls when the bell above her door chimed. "Mrs. Dorsey," Sheriff Bragg announced, adjusting his badge with obvious discomfort, "you're under arrest for presenting fraudulent land claims and disturbing the peace." Abigail's flour-covered hands stilled on the dough. "These charges are false, Sheriff. You know that." "Just following the law, ma'am." He wouldn't meet her eyes as he pulled out iron handcuffs. "Best come quietly." Through the window, Abigail caught sight of Mr. Castor watching from across the street, a satisfied smile on his face. She held her head high as the sheriff led her out, refusing to give him the satisfaction of seeing her fear. Townsfolk who had shown support in church now hurried past, averting their eyes. Mrs. Peterson pulled her children inside as Abigail passed. The weight of the community's renewed fear settled heavy in the air. Across town, Caleb was repairing a loose board on the bakery's storage shed when he heard horses approaching. Before he could react, 4 men surrounded him, rifles aimed at his chest. He recognized them as railroad-hired guns, their deputy badges freshly pinned. "Drop the hammer, Thorne," one ordered. "Sheriff says you're in violation of your labor contract." Caleb's jaw tightened. "There was no contract. Mrs. Dorsey purchased my freedom fair and square. That ain't how the railroad sees it?" The man tossed heavy iron shackles at Caleb's feet. "Put 'em on. You're headed back to work detail." Caleb measured his odds. 4 rifles against his hammer. He'd seen too many men die from pride. Slowly, he set down his tools and picked up the shackles. They marched him to a waiting wagon, its bed lined with fresh-cut railroad ties. Other prisoners, mostly native men and Chinese laborers, sat with bowed heads. As the guards chained him to the wagon's side, Caleb caught movement in the scrub brush beyond town. Henry Nez's familiar silhouette disappeared like a shadow, heading toward the trail that led to Devil's Bend. In the jailhouse, Abigail knelt on the rough wooden floor of her cell. The space was small, with only a narrow cot and a tin cup of water. Through the barred window, she could hear the regular rhythm of the telegraph office next door, clicking out messages she couldn't decode. "Lord," she whispered, pressing her clasped hands to her forehead, "give me strength to endure this trial. Watch over Caleb and guide those who might help us." The wagon carrying Caleb and the other prisoners creaked along the rutted trail, heading toward the railroad's western work camp. His wrists were raw from the shackles, but his mind remained sharp, counting landmarks and noting the guards' patterns. The lead guard dozed in his saddle while another passed a whiskey flask to his companion. Half a mile ahead lay Devil's Bend, where the trail curved sharply around a steep hillside. Caleb had scouted this territory years ago. He knew the loose shale and treacherous footing that waited there. More importantly, he knew the hidden paths that crisscrossed the hillside, perfect for an ambush. Henry Nez moved like a shadow through the scrub brush, his moccasins leaving no trace on the rocky ground. 3 younger warriors followed silently, carrying coils of rope and small bundles of supplies. They had watched the wagon's departure and chosen their position carefully. Devil's Bend offered only one safe path wide enough for a wagon. The rest was a maze of loose rock and steep drops. Henry touched the medicine pouch at his neck, offering a quiet prayer to the spirits of the land. Then he signaled his men to take their positions along the ridge. The sun was lowering toward the western hills as the wagon approached the bend. Henry crouched behind a boulder, watching the dust cloud that announced its coming. His warriors were in place, unseen but ready. The loose rocks they had carefully positioned would require only a small nudge to start sliding. In her cell, Abigail heard boots on the jailhouse steps. Sheriff Bragg appeared, carrying a tin plate with beans and hard bread. "Evening meal," he mumbled, sliding it through the bars. "Sheriff," Abigail said quietly, "you're a better man than this." Bragg's shoulders stiffened, but he didn't respond. As he turned to leave, Abigail noticed his hands were shaking slightly. She returned to her prayers, drawing strength from the faith that had sustained her through Thomas's death and every trial since. The wagon carrying Caleb creaked around the first curve leading into Devil's Bend. The horses seemed nervous, tossing their heads at the narrowing path. Above them, Henry Nez waited, with the patience of a lifetime spent reading the land and sky. His hand rested on a keystone, ready to send the carefully prepared cascade of rocks onto the trail below. The sun had set by the time the wagon reached Devil's Bend. The horses' hooves clattered on loose shale, echoing off the steep walls. Above them, Henry Nez gave a soft whistle that sounded exactly like a nighthawk's call. His warriors responded by releasing the carefully positioned rocks. The cascade started slowly, a few pebbles skittering down the slope. Then larger rocks followed, gathering speed. The horses reared in panic, and the guards shouted in alarm. The wagon lurched sideways as its wheels struck the falling debris. "Apache attack!" one guard yelled, raising his rifle toward the ridge. Before he could fire, a loop of rope snaked down from above, catching his weapon and yanking it away. More ropes appeared in the darkness, disarming the other guards. Henry's warriors moved with practiced efficiency, using the cover of night and confusion to their advantage. Caleb seized his moment. Despite his shackles, he managed to roll off the wagon, landing hard behind a boulder. He heard the guards cursing and stumbling in the dark, trying to control their frightened horses. Henry materialized beside him like a shadow. "Hold still," he whispered. producing a metal file from his medicine pouch. The shackles fell away after several tense minutes of work. "Much obliged," Caleb said, rubbing his raw wrists, "but we need to get back to town. They're planning to evict Abigail at first light." Henry's weathered face was grave in the starlight. "Force alone won't stop them. We need something more powerful than guns or numbers." "What do you mean?" "The white man's own words, written down where they can't deny them." Henry gestured toward town. "The preacher man. He keeps more than one book of records." Understanding dawned on Caleb's face. "Pastor Ellis's home. You think there's something there that could help?" "There's always more than one path to water," Henry said. "Sometimes the one less traveled holds what we seek." They moved quickly through the darkness, leaving Henry's warriors to handle the disarmed guards. The night air was cool, carrying the scent of sage and distant rain. As they approached the outskirts of town, they could see lamplight still burning in Pastor Ellis's modest home. Caleb knocked softly on the back door. After a long moment, they heard shuffling footsteps. "Who's there?" Pastor Ellis's voice quavered. "Caleb Thorne and Henry Nez. We need your help, Pastor." The door opened a crack, revealing Ellis's anxious face. "You've escaped?" "Lord have mercy, they'll blame me for—" "No time for fear now, Pastor," Henry said quietly. "You know what's right. The question is, will you stand for it?" Ellis hesitated, then opened the door wider. "Come in, quickly." Inside, the pastor's study was cramped but orderly, lined with books and church records. Ellis lit a lamp with trembling hands. "I've been praying about this all evening. What Mr. Castor and the sheriff did today. It isn't right." "We need proof," Caleb said. "Something they can't ignore or forge?" Ellis nodded slowly. "There might be something. When I was organizing the old records last spring, I found—" He moved to a shelf and pulled down a dusty volume. "Here." The previous pastor kept a separate ledger for special annotations. He opened the book carefully, its leather binding crackling. The pages were filled with neat script, dating back 20 years. Ellis thumbed through them with purpose until he stopped at an entry near the back. "Here," he said, voice growing stronger. An addendum from 1873, Federal Land Surveyor James Mackenzie's own handwriting, confirming the spring's sacred designation under the territory's Native Protection Act. Caleb leaned closer, reading the faded ink. The surveyor's words were clear and unambiguous, describing the spring's location and its protected status. More importantly, it bore an official government seal. "This is what we need," Caleb said. "The marshal can't ignore a federal surveyor's declaration." Henry touched the page gently. "My father spoke of this man Mackenzie. He was one who kept his word, respected our sacred places." Ellis carefully removed the pages. "Take them. Use them to set things right." His voice grew firmer. "And I'll come with you, testify to their authenticity myself." Through the window, they could see the sky beginning to lighten in the east. Dawn wasn't far off. "We need to hurry," Caleb said. "Castor will try to evict Abigail as soon as there's light enough to read the papers." Henry nodded. "I'll gather some of our people. The town should see that both Apache and settler stand together on this." They moved quickly through the pre-dawn darkness, Ellis clutching the precious documents to his chest. The town was still quiet, but lights were already burning in the marshal's temporary office above the bank. They could see shadows moving inside, Castor and his men preparing for their morning's work. Caleb's jaw tightened as they approached the jail. Soon, they would confront Castor and the marshal with proof that couldn't be denied. The truth about the spring and the railroad's deception would finally come to light. The pale light of dawn crept over Grafton Junction's rooftops. Caleb and Henry moved like shadows through the quiet streets, keeping close to the building's weathered walls. The morning air was crisp, carrying the scent of wood smoke from early rising households. They reached the jailhouse just as the sun's first rays touched its barred windows. Deputy Matthews stood at his post, dark circles under his eyes from the night watch. When he saw them approach, his hand twitched toward his gun, but recognition softened his features. "Figured you'd come," Matthews whispered, glancing over his shoulder. "Sheriff's up at the hotel, planning with Castor." He pulled a ring of keys from his belt, pressing them into Caleb's rough palm. "Third key from the left. Make it quick." Inside, their boots echoed on the wooden floor. Abigail sat upright on her cell's narrow cot, her gray-streaked hair loose around her shoulders. Despite the night in jail, her eyes remained clear and determined. "Caleb?" she whispered, rising to her feet. "How did you—" "No time to explain," he murmured, working the key into the lock. The mechanism clicked, and the cell door swung open with a soft creak. Abigail stepped out, straightening her wrinkled skirts. "I heard them planning. They mean to take the bakery this morning. Proof or no proof." "Then they're in for a surprise?" Henry said, producing the leather-bound ledger pages from his coat. "The Creator provides paths we don't always see at first." Abigail's eyes widened as she scanned the surveyor's neat script. This is exactly what we needed. But will the marshal listen? "He'll have to," Caleb said. "These are federal documents with official seals. Even the railroad can't ignore them." The church bell began to toll, its deep bronze voice rolling across the awakening town. 6 clear notes rang out, calling the faithful to morning prayers. But today, those bells would summon more than just worship. They emerged from the jail into strengthening sunlight. Already, townsfolk were gathering in the square. Drawn by the commotion at the marshal's office, Castor stood on the bank's steps, surrounded by his railroad men. His usual polished appearance showed signs of strain. His collar wilted, his vest slightly askew. "There she is," Castor called out, pointing at Abigail. "Marshal, the escaped prisoner." But Caleb's voice cut through the morning air like a rifle shot. "The only criminal here is you, Castor." He strode forward, the ledger held high. "And we've got proof of your fraud right here." The marshal, who had been conferring with the sheriff, turned sharply. "What's the meaning of this disruption?" More townspeople were arriving now, forming a loose circle around the confrontation. Pastor Ellis hurried forward, his Bible clutched to his chest. "Marshal Fletcher, I can verify these documents. They're from my church records, and they prove Mrs. Dorsey's rightful claim to the spring." Castor's face reddened. "This is absurd. These criminals have no standing." "Let me see those papers," Marshal Fletcher demanded, holding out his hand. Caleb passed them over carefully. The marshal's weathered face remained impassive as he read, but his eyebrows rose slightly at the sight of the federal seal. Henry stepped forward, his dignity commanding attention. "That spring has been sacred to my people since before any of your laws were written. But even by those laws, it is protected." The marshal looked up from the documents, his expression grave. "This surveyor's declaration is legally binding. The spring falls under federal protection as a sacred site." He turned to Castor. "And attempting to seize it through fraudulent means is a serious offense." Castor's composure cracked. "You can't possibly— The railroad has invested—" "The railroad," Marshal Fletcher said coldly, "will need to find another route. And you, sir, will need to explain these forged documents to a federal judge." A murmur ran through the crowd. Abigail stood straight-backed beside Caleb, her hand finding his work-roughened fingers. The touch was brief but steady, like a prayer of thanksgiving. The morning sun climbed higher, warming the dew-damp streets. Townsfolk began to press closer, no longer afraid to show where they stood. Mrs. Peterson from the dress shop stepped forward with a basket of fresh bread. "Welcome back, Abigail," she said firmly. "We've missed your baking." Others followed her lead, offering quiet words of support or simply nodding in respect. The wall of fear that Castor had built began to crumble, neighbor by neighbor, heart by heart. The marshal rolled up the ledger pages carefully. "Deputy, take Mr. Castor into custody. We'll sort this out properly at the territorial court." He turned to Abigail. "Mrs. Dorsey, I believe you have a bakery to attend to." Castor's protests faded as Matthews led him away. The gathered crowd began to disperse, though many lingered, sharing relieved smiles and quiet conversations. The morning's tension dissolved into something warmer, like spring snow melting in sunshine. Henry touched Abigail's shoulder gently. "The spirits of the spring will rest easier now," he said, "and so will your husband's memory." The church bell tolled once more, reminding them that the day's regular worship service would soon begin. But in many ways, the truest prayers had already been answered. Prayers for justice, for courage, and for the power of truth to overcome deception. The morning sun cast long shadows across the town square as Caleb unfolded the weathered pages. His deep voice carried clearly through the crisp air, reading the surveyor's careful script with deliberate precision. "By authority of the United States Land Office, dated 1872, he began, I hereby confirm that the natural spring located on the Dorsey homestead bears significant cultural importance to the local Apache people. As such, this water source falls under federal protection as designated sacred land." The crowd pressed closer, their breaths held in collective anticipation. Caleb continued, his voice growing stronger with each word. "Furthermore, stewardship of said spring was legally transferred to James Dorsey and his heirs through proper channels, with the understanding that access for ceremonial purposes would be maintained in perpetuity." Abigail stood tall beside him, her hands clasped tightly at her apron. The morning light caught the silver in her hair, lending her an almost luminous dignity. Henry Nez nodded solemnly, his weathered face reflecting generations of wisdom. Pastor Ellis stepped forward, his Bible clutched tight against his chest. "Marshal Fletcher," he called out, his voice trembling but clear, "I must speak to the character of Mr. Castor and his methods." The marshal nodded, gesturing for Ellis to continue. The pastor's shoulders straightened as he faced the assembled townspeople. "3 nights ago, Mr. Castor came to my home. He offered me $500 to misplace certain pages from our church records." Ellis's voice cracked with shame. "When I refused, he threatened to ensure our church would never see another donation from railroad families." A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. Several prominent railroad workers' wives exchanged horrified glances while their husbands shuffled uncomfortably. Castor's face had gone from red to purple. "You sanctimonious old fool! You have no proof!" "Actually," the marshal interrupted, "witness testimony of attempted bribery is quite admissible in territorial court." He turned to Sheriff Bragg, who had been inching toward the edge of the crowd. "Sheriff, I believe you have some explaining to do as well." Bragg's shoulders slumped. The bluster that had carried him through years of bullying seemed to deflate all at once. "I was just following orders," he muttered, unbuckling his gun belt. "Railroad men said jump. We jumped. That's how it's always been." "Not anymore," came a voice from the crowd. It was Mrs. Peterson, the seamstress, stepping forward with fierce determination. "We've watched too long while good folks like Abigail got pushed around. Ain't right, and ain't Christian neither." Murmurs of agreement swelled through the gathering. More townspeople moved to stand near Abigail and Caleb, forming a human barrier between them and Castor's remaining men. The marshal studied the surveyor's document one final time, then rolled it carefully and handed it back to Abigail. "Mrs. Dorsey, these papers establish your clear legal right to that land and spring. Mr. Castor's supposed deeds are hereby declared fraudulent." He turned to Deputy Matthews. "Take Mr. Castor into custody. We'll escort him to the territorial court ourselves." As Matthews approached with handcuffs ready, Castor backed away, his polished appearance completely undone. "This is outrageous." The railroad will hear of this. We'll have this whole town condemned." "The railroad," Marshal Fletcher said firmly, "will be receiving a full report about your activities here. I suspect they'll be quite interested in how their agent attempted to steal federally protected land through forged documents." Caleb stepped forward, his massive frame towering over Castor. "Might want to go quietly," he suggested, his voice low but carrying clear across the square. "Seeing as how you're fresh out of friends here." The fight seemed to drain from Castor all at once. He allowed Matthews to lead him away, his fine boots dragging in the dust. A strange silence fell over the square, broken only by the soft morning breeze and distant meadowlarks. Then someone began to clap. The sound spread like wildfire through the crowd, building to a thunderous applause that echoed off the weathered buildings. Abigail's eyes welled with tears, as neighbors who had once mocked her now pressed forward to offer congratulations and apologies. Mrs. Peterson enveloped her in a warm embrace, while others reached out to pat her shoulder or clasp her hand. "Your honey rolls were always the best in town anyway," old Mr. Thompson called out, earning scattered laughter. "Railroad bread's too fancy by half." Through it all, Caleb remained at Abigail's side, a steady presence as the town's approval washed over them. Henry Nez approached quietly, touching his heart in a gesture of respect. "The spring will flow clear," he said softly, knowing it rests in hands that understand its worth. Pastor Ellis wiped his eyes with a handkerchief. "Amen to that," he said. "Amen indeed." The marshal cleared his throat. "Mrs. Dorsey, I'll need these documents registered properly at the territorial office, but I believe you have a bakery to attend to first." Abigail smiled, smoothing her apron with work-worn hands. The morning sun had climbed higher, promising a bright new day for Grafton Junction, one built on truth, justice, and the courage of those who stood firm against corruption. The autumn breeze carried the scent of fresh baked bread through Grafton Junction's streets. Inside Dorsey's bakery, sunlight streamed through newly repaired windows, catching dust motes that danced above stacked loaves and cooling pies. Caleb worked steadily at the counter, his large hands surprisingly gentle as he kneaded dough beside Abigail. The marshal's decree had freed him officially, but he had chosen to stay, finding purpose in honest work and quiet companionship. "Reckon these will be ready by sundown," he said, shaping the dough into neat rolls. His voice, once guarded, now carried a warmth that matched the bakery's cozy atmosphere. Abigail nodded, her eyes crinkling with pleasure. Just in time for the gathering. She paused, watching him work. The man who had arrived in chains now moved with quiet confidence, his scarred face softened by peace. The bell above the door chimed as Henry Nez entered, followed by his wife and grandchildren. The children's eyes widened at the sight of fresh cookies cooling on racks, while Henry's wife carried a basket of wild herbs and berries. "For the feast," she explained, setting the basket down. "These plants have fed our people for generations." Several townswomen, led by Mrs. Peterson, arrived shortly after, their initial hesitation melting as Henry's wife demonstrated how to weave the herbs into bread. Soon, the bakery hummed with conversation and laughter, bridging cultures over shared work. As afternoon shadows lengthened, Abigail and Caleb found themselves alone for a moment in the storage room, organizing supplies for the evening meal. The air between them felt charged with unspoken understanding. "Never thought I'd find peace here," Caleb said softly, his hand resting near hers on a flour barrel. "Or family." Abigail's heart quickened at the word. "The Lord works in mysterious ways," she replied, her voice gentle. "Sometimes the longest trails lead us right where we need to be." Their eyes met, acknowledging the profound shift in their lives. From widow and prisoner to partners, their shared courage had forged something deeper than either expected. The bakery, once Abigail's lonely refuge, now pulsed with new life and possibility. Outside, the sound of more visitors approaching broke the moment, but the warmth remained. They had found their place, not just in the town, but with each other. Lanterns swayed gently in the evening breeze, casting warm pools of light across the bakery's courtyard. The spring blessing feast had drawn what seemed like the entire town of Grafton Junction, along with families from the Apache settlement. The air was rich with the aroma of fresh-baked bread, sage, and pine smoke. Children darted between tables laden with steaming dishes, their laughter mixing with the sweet notes of Henry's grandson's wooden flute. Mrs. Peterson taught two Apache girls how to braid challah dough, while Henry's wife showed townswomen the proper way to steep desert tea. Abigail stood in the doorway of her bakery, taking in the scene with misty eyes. Just months ago, these same streets had echoed with mockery. Now the sound of genuine fellowship filled the air. Pastor Ellis led a blessing over the feast, his words bridging two cultures with respect and gratitude. Caleb appeared at her side, something large hidden behind his back. "Got something for you, Miss Dorsey?" he said softly, his usual gruffness gentled by affection. From behind his back, he produced a freshly carved wooden sign, its letters deep and sure. Dorsey and Thorne Bakery, Bread, Honor, Family. Abigail's hand flew to her heart. The ampersand between their names spoke volumes about their journey from that muddy auction day to this moment of shared triumph. "It's perfect," she whispered, touching the carved letters. "Just perfect." Together, they watched the celebration unfold. The marshal shared a joke with Henry Nez, their laughter genuine and easy. Young couples danced to the flute music, while elders from both communities exchanged stories in the lamplight. Caleb's shoulder brushed against Abigail's as they stood side by side. The touch was gentle but sure, like their path forward together. They had found more than partnership in their stand against injustice. They had found family, not just with each other, but with an entire community united in celebration of dignity restored. The lantern light caught the silver in Abigail's hair and the scars on Caleb's weathered face, marking them not as broken people, but as testament to the healing power of mercy and the strength found in standing together. If this one resonated with you, stick around. I've got another story waiting for you tomorrow, and who knows, it might be just what you needed to hear.